That's where I lived. Let me tell you a story.
What was the neighborhood like early days?
Mostly Italian, not as much Puerto Rican as it became, and not as much gentrified as it is now. There was some transitional problems because of the ethnicities, so we were not always welcome. You want me to pose old school? My name is Harv Roman, probably best known in one area for my association with WCYC Radio, but then in a whole nother area when I was with the Union League Boys and Girls Clubs, people probably know me for that.
Let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up? What neighborhood?
So we probably settled in Westtown in maybe 66, something like that. Puerto Ricans were few and far in between. It was still mostly an Italian area, known more for the mob figures, like Big Tuna lived over there, and Frank Collado lived over there, and all of these figures that became somewhat famous. I knew one of the Spalatros fairly well because he was a club kid, but I never looked at the Spalatros like the casino characters. They were just guys from the neighborhood. But of course, we find out different that the nice old man was Big Tuna. But to us, he was the nice old man.
As a kid, were you fans of listening to the radio? If so, what stations? And who were some of the disc jockeys back then?
Well, this is going to sound harsh, and forgive me, Mom. I was not allowed to watch TV. So the TV was in my sister's room. Forgive me, sister. Because I wasn't allowed to watch the one TV, I'm listening to the radio. And at that time, you had WLS, which was big, the big 89, and Larry Lujak was a jock, and Steve King was on there. John Leindecker was on there. And so I would get a kick out of listening to WLS, which at the time was like top 40 radio. So I still enjoy that. And people still have interesting reactions to me liking Boston and Kiss, disco, and also freestyle and house, because one led to the other. Steve Dahl was on WDAI. Before they turned disco, they were a rock station. So I'm a big Steve Dahl fan. I'm listening to Steve Dahl. And then when he went to the Loop, that's when DAI turned to disco. So I followed him to the Loop, and I'm listening to Steve Dahl in the morning, The Rude Awakening. But then after that, I'd go back to DAI, and like, this disco stuff ain't so bad. So I'm that rare kid that enjoyed the disco that was starting to be played with the rock that Steve Dahl was playing. I got a kick out of Disco Demolition. I did not like disco being demolished, but I was a Steve Dahl fan. So I ended up staying in that realm as a fan of dance music, but I still enjoy Led Zeppelin. It's weird how it worked out. When I got to CYC, they were playing house music as opposed to freestyle. I landed there in 85. TK and Cover Girls like 86-ish. And Kenny can't argue with this. They used to lock up the music after Friday nights. So I'm getting there on my Saturday to do my Saturday shows. And then I had people that I was working with and teaching, and they were doing their specialty programs. And Gloria's doing the alternative show, and Jesse's doing the rock show. What am I going to do? Tony was my DJ at the time. You know, we had a mobile disco, there you go, that's a dated term. And so I'm borrowing stuff from Tony. Tony's flavor was like the Latin stuff. It wasn't yet called freestyle, but that's what it was. And so this is what I'm playing at CYC back when it was still house, because the music is getting locked up. I need something to play. I'll just grab Tony's stuff and play this. And that might be the understated, underreported story of why CYC eventually became more known for freestyle. If I was one of Kenny's students back then, probably would never discovered freestyle.
So when you're talking about Tony, we're talking about Tony Boom Boom Badea.
Tony Boom Boom Badea. I was with a mobile disco, and I was the fourth guy in that, and I worked the mic. Tony was in a DJ group, which included his cousin, and he was the fourth guy in that group. And I would listen to him spin like that 7 o'clock hour in the beginning of the party, and he was better than all these other guys. I'm like, okay, this guy's playing at 7, and then his job is done. Tony, at that age, 13, 14, he's good, but he's number 4. So I don't know how we made that conversation, but we're like, you know what? If we work together, you don't have to be the last guy on that totem pole, and I don't have to be the last guy on that totem pole. And that's how we started doing our weddings and our cotillions. And it wasn't even Boom Boom at the time. He was Tony. The Boom Boom came along later on with a promoter's wife who thought it would be a cool name to give Tony, and that's how that happened. We were wedding and cotillion DJs. It took a little while for people to start booking him as a live mixer, as a guest, and he was young enough that I was handling the manager type stuff in order to get him gigs. Eventually, our group included Caesar the Beat, Echeverria. I met him at the big battle at the Rainbow in '84, the Northside battle, because Tony was in it already, so I'm there with Tony, and I was like, this guy's good, and I invited him to give us tapes of CYC, and his mixes used to include beats from a drum machine. Caesar the Beat. And that's how that nickname happened. And fast forward to 2024, when you see him on a plugger, what are they calling him? Caesar the Beat. So we all became buddies and friends, and then that was my little mobile team, Tony and Caesar, and I don't have to spin anymore because Tony's too good. I'm not doing this DJ stuff anymore. I got a kid that makes me look silly. So let's just get him gigs, and I don't have to spin anymore. And then at some point, people were hiring me to work the mic and hiring Tony to work the decks. And Caesar got the same treatment.
And this was pre-house music, technically, the genre.
Yeah.
There was the house culture and the style. What were the parties like before there was actually a genre?
The parties revolved around the music. There were not a lot of live events in terms of performers. It was the DJs were the attraction. And you would go, and you know this, you would go to these events and certain records would get thrown on and the crowd would go nuts. We did a couple of recordings. I used to have a portable, and I would plug in a mic to mix the mic with the crowd sounds, because I got a kick out of noticing the crowd popping for when a new song was getting mixed in. And so there would be an entire event with no live performers. It was all DJs, and they bought into the music. They really loved the music. And if you were really good, when you're bringing in the next song, and here's the song playing at the same time, the crowd would pop for that. And we've kind of gotten away from that a little bit because there's so many live events, I guess. I used to get excited about watching the DJs work just because of how the crowd responded to them in certain songs. And the crowd also did the opposite. If you played something that wasn't going to work, they'd leave the floor. There was a song called Who's Your Boyfriend by Eric. And the first time he played it, I think it was Masters Hall on Ashland Avenue. I can't believe I remember that. And everybody left the floor. The floor is empty. And I said, man, Tony goes, no, this song is going to work, you'd see. And not too long after that, everybody was playing Who's Your Boyfriend by Eric. But when he debuted it at Masters Hall, nobody wanted anything to do with it. But, the crowd is finicky. Breakdance culture was happening at that time, too. So I guess you can't breakdance to Who's Your Boyfriend, I guess. There were some promoters that were doing live acts. There was a few, but not that many.
So more like the bigger acts were at Rainbow, Tony Batoy and all that stuff, or was this prior to that?
No, yeah, Batoy was his thing. Pinky was doing the Pan American Festival, and I got to meet them because when I started at CYC 85, 86, they would give us tickets to give away to the listeners, so I got to meet them and get to know them. But those were considered the big events, though. If you're working for Tony Batoy or All Star Productions, then you were someone. The little guys, so to speak, they weren't getting a whole lot of opportunities, or you're doing like Tony, you're spinning at 7 at night, till maybe 7:30, and hoping to get your name on a plugger as payment. When you became that good, then they would pay your price. And that's ultimately what happened. George Lamont was a perfect example of that too. He wasn't touched as a live act for a while. I met him as Loose Touch with Kenny and Eddie. And I tried to get him booked with some of the promoters who shall remain nameless. Chris Barbosa was his manager at the time, and the price to me was very reasonable. Promoters said, we're not going to pay that. We don't know this kid, and so we're not going to pay. And it might have been like $1,500. And I remember Chris Barbosa telling me, he says, they'll pay. And eventually George blew up, and guess what? They paid, and they could have got him for a lot less. KL's another perfect example of that. When he morphed from TK to K7, there were promoters that they didn't know who K7 was. Because K7, if you remember, was a symbol at the time. It was just the K and the 7 and the red diamond. They weren't saying it was like that used to be TK. They were just saying it's K7. And it was the same thing, trying to get bookings, and nobody's booking them. I convinced the prime and tenor to bring him in. I remember him telling me, we're giving you this price once, just once. We're going to break market, and that's it. And don't tell anybody how much you're paying. And he was exactly right. They came in, they did it. The other promoters took notice, and then they paid the price that they needed to pay. So that was a one-time only Harv price. But promoters in Chicago, unfortunately, that was the culture. It was, hook a brother up, we'll do you a favor, we'll put you on the flyer. They didn't even talk about gas money. We were young, and we wanted to be on these pluggers, and we wanted to be on these events. The logistics of a full hall of paid customers didn't hit us right away. We're just happy to be there. We didn't make any money. A lot of those young DJs didn't make any money. The promoters did pretty good.
How did you get the CYC gig?
Dante Plata, he was a reverend. I don't know how he became aware of us, but they hired us to DJ for this 7-Up marathon or something like that. Vince Gomez at the time was the director of the Little Village Boys and Girls Club, and he happened upon us. And he told me that there was a radio station at the Little Village Boys and Girls Club. And I said, oh, and he said, yeah, maybe you should go over there. And I went there and I met Harold Kopta, who at the time was the director of WCYC, Kenny's boss, and he was the program director. I got in there and it was like learn the ropes, play all the syndicated stuff, and I didn't have a show, and I'm there just pressing buttons and learning whatever. And every now and then they throw a little treat and I get to read the news or something like that. And Harold Kopta, may he rest in peace, decided to offer me the morning slot, 8 to 12 on Saturdays, which didn't make Kenny happy because Kenny and this guy who became a broadcaster, like a big-time broadcaster, but he wasn't showing up. And so Kenny wasn't happy. The other guy wasn't happy. Harold said the guy was missing too much, and so they offered it to me. And like I said already, they were locking up the music. So then I had to take 4 hours and figure out classic hits, alternative that, rock this. I had a disc guy, Tim Baker, who has passed away recently. He went from Chicago to Detroit. And Tim Baker became a pretty big deal in Detroit. He was a CYC guy. He was doing disco shows at CYC at the time for us. So I mixed it up enough on Saturday mornings that we were filling in the 4 hours with different types of music. That's what I did for a while, and I was teaching those kids. When Kenny decided that he was going to leave, it might have been in 87, he decided that he was going to leave the station in the hands of Pedro Rodriguez of the Young Sounds and Harv Roman, who nobody knew, who was doing this stuff on Saturday. That was a controversial decision in itself, and Kenny thought it should be in a couple of people's hands. I talked to him about it later in life, and he says, I knew you in your background. You were with the Boys and Girls Club. You were a leader. You were already in charge of people, and I liked that. So he trusted that I would know how to deal with people and develop broadcasters.
And when we're talking about Kenny, we're talking about Kenny Jam and Jason from the Hot Mix 5. Later, WBMX fame, but Disco DAI.
He was doing Disco DAI, which is how I knew of him because I was a fan of Disco DAI. So when I met him at CYC, I used to call him the sheriff because he used to wear his gear because he worked for the Cook County.
So over the years, there's been plenty of alumni from WCYC, people who've come through there. Who are some that kind of stand out to you?
My most popular alum that I actually taught was Rick Party. But when I say that I taught him, that's a stretch. He got to me and he was just good already. Besides teaching him board work or something. And if you ever read anything that he writes or taught, he always says the radio station in Little Village, WCYC, and he says my name. Truth of the matter is he was just good. He was a teenager, but he was good. So I didn't touch him. This is the studio. Here's the board work. Go for it. And he was just that good. He was that good from the get. Candy Gomez was another alum that did well at CYC under her actual name. Now she has a radio name. Zanny Glover. He was a CYC kid. Irie Mojica was a CYC kid. There was a good number of CYC kids that did well. You needed to go out and do it. CYC wasn't going to place you anywhere. They were going to give you that platform as a young person, and then you decide what you're going to do with it. When Rick left us, he's like, I'm going to South Carolina. And then he's worked every market imaginable. I like the legacy that we have. And there was also a good legacy with the Spanish broadcasting. Some may or may not remember at one point, CYC was a combination of Spanish programming and English programming. And there were days that CYC was only on from 3 to 6 because you had all your community stuff up until 3 o'clock. And you had Spanish programming at 6 o'clock. So you got 3 hours. And if you're lucky, you get to listen to what's going on.
One of the most famous from the station is Magic Juan.
Magic Juan. We've started like a month apart, and he has a street sign now right outside the Little Village Boys and Girls Club on 28th and Ridgeway. We started off at almost the same time. He had to prove himself the herald because Juan was legally blind, but he did. I will forever be amazed at what Juan was able to do. He's working vinyl. Eventually he's working carts, and he knew exactly what he was playing. Once he was taught the board, and he ran his own board. He would have the occasional, like little Laura Hernandez. There were people that would produce for him every now and then, but he ran his own stuff. Nobody had a collection like he had. Eventually, he was a co-program director for a little while. He was music director for a little while. Of course, his claim to fame would be the Dusty shows that he used to do. He's doing live events. He's doing stuff at nightclubs. He was amazing. He was absolutely amazing.
You said he was traveling down there on the bus with record crates.
He'd be on the bus with record crates. And of course, he's doing the nighttime show. And 26th Street at the time, we won't call them gangs. We'll call them negative youth groups. I was at a training once. It was a New York-based training. I'm with the Boys and Girls Clubs, and the guy comes out and he says, "There are no gangs in New York. There are only negative youth groups." So that's where I came up with that. So on 26th Street, there was a negative youth group like on every corner. And Juan's taking the bus. At the time, he wasn't doing cabs, and he couldn't always get a ride. And nobody would touch him. Nobody would mess with him. Everybody knew who Magic Juan was. They either knew him because of what he was doing on Monday nights and eventually Friday nights with the radio shows, or they knew him from the live events. Nobody messed with him. Nobody, and no matter what the time was, nobody messed with him. I worried about him, and I wouldn't want him doing the late hours. And he would assure me that nothing was going to happen. And to his credit, nobody bothered him. And now there's a street sign outside of 28th and Ridgeway for that guy. And I wish he would have been alive. He was proud of his roots in terms of Little Village. He would brag about the music that he played that nobody else had. Like he would listen to this and it'd be a group that, who's this? But he had his thumb on the pulse of so much when it came to that. It took him a minute to embrace freestyle. He was not a fan of freestyle until he got more involved in the programming, because at that time you could see the fight lights, and people were calling in and making requests or whatever. And so he understood that the community was in love with freestyle. He wasn't in love with freestyle. He had to be encouraged to book him when he was doing stuff at the Prime and Tender. Once those events became successful, Juan really loved freestyle. But in the beginning, no, freestyle wasn't. He was a Dusties guy. And if it was from the 70s, the 60s, he loved it. If it was dance music, it maybe disco, he would buy. It took him a while, but when he would bring in the acts and become friends with the acts, that made all the difference in the world because it became personal. Once the music was filling in his events, then you're going to like it that much more.
If you were on the south side, southwest side, in the 80s, even into the 90s, freestyle was definitely a sound, but there was other sounds like alternative music.
Right. I had a girl named Gloria Roca, and when I was filling in those 4 hours on Saturdays, I'm like, what can I do? And my buddy Jesse, just like you, he said, well, my sister likes to play REM and U2, and he's naming these bands, Fine Young Cannibals. I don't know who these people are, but because she's willing to do the show, she's the one that started off that whole alternative thing that Alternative John ended up picking up. I don't know what CYC was doing in terms of, I don't know that they were doing anything with alternative music. She was my buddy's sister. This is what she liked. Let's let her have a show. And it picked up some steam. And John, of all people, loved her show. She announces on the air that she's going to leave CYC. She's going to college. She became a sound engineering major of all things at Columbia. So she announces it, and here comes Alternative John asking if he could have her show. I don't know the guy, but he listened to Gloria's show. So I had him come in, taught him the board, and said, okay, now John has a show. Now his brother Oscar is very well known in the alternative realm of music, but John started that. He played music that the band names were a little bit revolting, if you know which band I'm talking about. And I'm like, I can't let him play this stuff, but it was what it was. I think people don't always think about WCYC as having had anything to do with alternative music. I'm saying that Gloria and John were playing stuff that XRT wasn't playing. XRT would have been the alternative station at the time. And they were playing stuff that wasn't getting played. And the kids on the South Side, it turned out, they didn't always want freestyle and house music. There were some, maybe yourself included, that were listening to stuff that wasn't Cynthia and Johnny O and George Lamond. Yeah, we had a nice little pocket of listeners for that. And I got to credit Gloria for initiating it, and then John for picking up on it, and then Oscar, he's made a nice little DJ career out of that stuff too.
Yeah, and then Vic Lua,
Pablo.
Luis Guerra.
Pablo was another one of those. He wasn't trained, but I liked his collection. I liked what he was playing. So I don't remember how it came up, and I'm like, well, there's a 12 o'clock slot on Saturday, and I didn't touch him. I don't know if there's an air check that exists of Pablo Punk Out Gonzalez, the punky DJ. If you ever listened to him back then, he would do these weird character voices. He would just screech, and it was the strangest show in terms of personality because he didn't sound like a radio guy. He just sounded like some guy that found a mic and was just clowning around. His collection, just like John's, there was a niche for that on the South Side, and he ended up with a fandom that we didn't have. His air checks, nobody would have confused him to be a DJ. He just screamed and screeched and would talk to himself, but it worked. The uniqueness of his personality clicked with somebody because he ended up with a nice little following.
Over the years, we were part of different scenes, but when it came to the parties, that's where we all met up.
We had talked off the air too a little bit about the dance crews, and I told you that Troy Winston of Imported Taste was one of my high school classmates. At that time, I thought it was just this little group at Wells that was running around, but it turned out, with them and the Floor Masters there was like these little dance crews that were out just having a good time. They weren't being violent. They weren't causing problems. There might be a battle on the dance floor, but they weren't going toe-to-toe in hand-to-hand combat. And I managed a dance group for a little while, the Zodiacs, at one point too. And my experience with those dance groups was that these were a lot of kids that were not the stereotypical traditional kid in the neighborhood. In their own way, they might have been the outcast with the cool kids. So now they're in the dance groups. And now they're battling at the Rainbow, and they're at the Centrum Hall, and they're on the South Side at Highlanders. And so all of a sudden, the crowd's applauding for these kids that were somewhat of the outcast, somewhat of the nerd, for lack of a better term. And those dance crews, when you think about it, they did so much for these kids that may or may not have had both parents, that may or may not have, the role models, and all they wanted to do was dance. I think there's a segment of that population of that era that if not for the dance group, you don't know what would have happened. You don't know because you've got these different choices that you make. And what if you want to run with the gangs instead? What if you had made that decision instead of being an Imported Taste dancer? So they were able to express themselves, and they got a lot of accolades. At its peak, when they did the Battle of the Dancers at the Rainbow, and the Rainbow filled with like 3,500 people, and Imagen was there, Channel 60 was there, and they showed some of the video on the TV. That's when these kids became stars. And I like that Jose wrote books about it, because when we were talking about it, we trade all these stories, just like you and I were doing, trading stories, but it wasn't documented, so it's just stories. Jose wrote 2 books about the dance crews, and he changed the name of some people, like Troy, but then there's Troy's picture in the book. So I'm like, wait a minute, that's Troy, and that's Al, and that's Beatrice, who passed away recently. Heavenly respect to her and Troy as well, who's no longer with us. But this is how they were able to have their stars shine. Similar to the CYC story. You got kids taking radio classes when they're 14, 15, 16 years old, and now they're stars, and people could only hear their voice, and they became little celebrities back then. And I think my background with the Boys and Girls Clubs and youth development helped me when I'm working with these kids as radio students. Now Gino's back to doing these daytime parties, and I remember the original daytime parties where you would either get a flyer or a phone number, and you're calling the number to get instructions from an answering machine, and then there's another set of instructions before you finally got to the daytime, because at the time the kids were too young to party anywhere else. So if there's no school, there's a daytime, but you don't want the cops to be there. So all of a sudden, this is how they got around it. And I'll give Gino credit when he decided, let's start doing daytimes. I go, man, I remember daytimes. And that was, at least on the south side, my experience at CYC, it was like solving a riddle, because you would get all these little hints. And then if you collected enough information, now all of a sudden you're at a daytime party. When you think about, I landed there in 85, right? Mm-hmm. And Kenny got there in the late 70s. For people to still talk about that place 40 some years later, that's what I get a kick out of. I'm like, how do these people still remember?
So over the years of working at CYC, working in radio, you've definitely talked to a lot of folks, features, interviews. Any of those experiences stick out?
At one point, I did get involved in doing a lot of these interviews with the comics. The one that I seem to be most connected to by people is George Lopez. When I met him, it was 1992, and I read about him. He was going to be at a place in Aurora, and I'm reading this little story. And I said, well, he's got a Latin name. And so I called the comedy club that he was performing at and put in an interview request with whoever was there. And lo and behold, he calls me back. And we ended up to this day, we ended up becoming friends. And I remember he signed an autograph to me maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And I was like, to somebody who treated me like a somebody when I was a nobody. He always remembered that I'm giving him airtime. And he would always tell me when he was in town, he'd call me, and when the Funny Firm was still open, he gave like 15 tickets, and I'm bringing people from the Boys and Girls Club to watch this guy perform. And when he became big, that didn't change. That didn't change to this day. And we haven't seen each other in a few years, but he would always update me with his latest information. His daughter ended up going to Columbia College, which I thought was neat, because George and I had the Chicago connection. Somehow or another, his daughter ends up going to school in Chicago, and now she's a TV star herself. I think about the little girl that used to answer the phone when I would call George, just the call. Leguizamo was an interview that had a lot of legs with me, that he ended up on CYC. Anybody who was anybody when it came to freestyle, because at that point, they weren't getting played by very many people, and even less people were doing interviews with them.
I know you have a relationship with Brenda K. Starr.
Yeah, that's what she came in to do, Loyola University or something like that. And we ended up somehow becoming friends. I still don't know how it worked out, but we did an interview. And whatever my style of interview was, you end up touching on things that maybe other people don't ask. And when I was teaching radio, I would tell them, you need to get answers that nobody else can get. Because if you're asking the same questions everybody else is asking, one of my favorite spots with Brenda was when Mariah redid Brenda's song, And I'm interviewing Brenda, and on mic, she's saying, yeah, Mariah did a good job, but mine is better. Who else gets that? But yeah, we became, between Brenda and her husband and even her daughter, when her daughter first came out with music, she was 11 years old, and they're sending me this stuff. I was walking on Western Avenue from I don't know where, and then this car's honking. Brenda's in the car with a couple people that were hosting her because she's visiting Chicago, and they picked me up and dropped me off, and we're doing all this chit-chatting and talking. And then when they dropped me off at home, I'm like, why didn't we take a picture? That would have been nice. I think sometimes she doesn't get the credit that she deserves, even though she's had a big, long career. And then somebody will post a video of Mariah singing backup for her or something, and then all of a sudden it becomes a Mariah story rather than a Brenda story. Alex Ortiz, the comic, we became friends. He was a Clemente guy. And once we started comparing notes, I'm running the Boys and Girls Club that he was a kid at, and he's telling me these things like, oh, that's pretty neat. So there's enough common denominators with me in some of these that it works out nicely. And anybody that you may have given the first opportunity to, Rick Party, for example, there's some people that just don't forget that. And no matter what somebody like Rick has done, he will always go back to who gave him the first opportunity. At CYC, and even when I moved on to Loyola at LUW, I interviewed Crucial Conflict, and I think the youngest member at that time was 11. They became huge. And I'm like, but I remember those kids. But CYC had to be one of their first interviews, because like I said, their youngest member was 11.
Let's talk a little bit about Adolfo Shabadoo Quinones. People know the name from the movie Breakin'. Not until recent years we discovered his Chicago connection. Can you kind of give us a little background on that whole story?
Adolfo, yeah, you're right. It's an interesting story. Adolfo was a Chicago kid. Grew up on Erie Street and the Greens, Cabrini Green. Went to Talcott School, which was the same grade school that I went to. He went to several high schools, but he also went to Wells, which is a school that I went to. And I remember he and Michael Chambers, Boogaloo Shrimp, went to Talcott School to promote the movie Breakin' when it first came out in '84. I didn't know who they were, honestly. The kids were coming to the Boys and Girls Club talking about movie stars being at Talcott School. And eventually, like, oh, then the movie comes out. And I was like, that's who the kids were talking about. A few years later, I ended up connecting with him on social media, invited him to do an interview. And then he touches on his grade school years. He touches on his favorite teacher. He talks about the sandwich from Rosie's, which was a store across the street from Talcott School. And all of a sudden, it's a conversation. It's not an interview. And he's giving you stuff that he hasn't talked about before. And yeah, he would be one of those who would just call you out of the blue just to say hi. And he did. He had told me that he loved our conversations because I wasn't talking to Shabadoo. I was talking to Adolfo, and I didn't call him Shabadoo. I would listen to other people say Shab and Shabadoo and Ozone. The way I knew him, I'm calling him Adolfo. That's his name. And I found that interesting. We would talk about that sometimes. And he enjoyed the celebrityness of it all. He did not enjoy how he was sometimes treated or stereotyped. And so he wasn't Adolfo enough for some people, and he was Shabadoo Ozone for so many people. When he started doing workshops here, he asked me to help recruit the young people to take these workshops. So I got pictures with him and some of my club kids from back in the day in Humboldt Park, and they didn't know who he was. They just knew he was teaching them to dance, and they had a blast. Then eventually you're saying, that's the guy from the movie. He was very humble, very grounded, knew that he had worked with Michael Jackson, for instance, but that didn't take away from his pride from where he was from. But I think a lot of the national interviewers, they're not asking about that stuff. They don't know. They don't know, and I got lucky with some of the stuff that we talked about on mic. I think I was luckier with some of the stuff that we talked about beyond the mics. Because when you got that name on your caller ID for no reason, just because he wants to say hi, he's Adolfo. Well, he's Shabadoo. So to me, that was pretty neat. But when you end up meeting people and becoming close to them enough that they might call you or pick you up on the street and offer you a ride home. It's crazy because I didn't even write about it. I'm like, man, I should have just said I got picked up by Brenda K. Starr.
How did the street sign come about for him?
Adolfo's street sign we had with the alderman, Daniel Espada, on a May 11th. We had put in a request to get a holiday in his name, city holiday. To Daniel Espada's credit, he approved it. It was the year of the pandemic. They did one ceremony on Halsted in Chicago where the Greens used to be, but there was nothing there. And the woman who put that together, nice girl, people just, they didn't come out. Maybe it was pandemic related, I don't know. I had his brother go to the Boys and Girls Club, which is now Walcott School, and we presented him with a copy of the resolution. And the alderman makes a speech, and Adolfo's brother Eric makes a speech, and he talks about Adolfo shooting pool here, Adolfo getting his first trophy here. And so to me, that's what's huge, because when they become celebrities, they're celebrities, but we're all rooted somehow. We know we all have the seeds planted somewhere. The alderman promised that we would do a street sign, but he says we can't do it now because we can't do public gatherings because of the pandemic. So fast forward, I don't know, maybe 2 years later, something like that, I get an email from the alderman's office. He says, do you still want to do the street sign? I'm like, sure. And so we coordinated between the alderman's office and Adolfo's brother Eric, and there's this unveiling, and there's a nice little crowd, and his family, so a couple flew in from California. It was nice, and to me, he was a friend, but in a weird way, more importantly, he's a kid from the neighborhood that did good. So too often in my line of work, you would see kids look up to the guys that got the nice cars, but the way they made their money wasn't the most honorable way to make the money. Now you can point to this guy, and when I worked at Talcott over the summer, I had a teacher tell me that she saw us and the class was looking out the window when we were doing this thing. They just didn't know who he was. And when that happened, you had a couple of teachers doing a little bit of research to tell these kids, this guy went to your school. This guy was in 309. And it was nice. It would have obviously would have been great if he was still alive to see it. But depending on what you believe, maybe he did. Maybe he did. But kids do need relatable role models, and they don't always get them. And even in the culture that we live in now, some of the role models could be better. Adolfo was one of those that it was hard work, it was talent, and he did it the right way. And he's got a street sign.
With the anniversary of house music 40 years later, why do you think Chicago embraced it like it did?
Well, I think house music is pretty simple. It's from us. You could go to a record store, you could go to a live event, you could be walking down the street and you could run into these artists, the hip house artists or the house music artists, and they're just like you and I. They're just regular people, and you can relate to the music. And I think there's a certain pride in Chicago house music if you're from Chicago, just because it's Chicago. It's like when the DJ International compilation comes out, it's the house sound of Chicago. So there's a pride factor in house music because it's local. Just like when you go on the East Coast, there's a pride factor in the freestyle, or Latin hip hop as they called it back then, because it came from the East Coast. In terms of house music itself, for that picnic to get 30,000 people every year is amazing to me. And it's all kinds. It's not just one ethnicity. Everybody goes to the picnic. Everybody has a blast. And they're proud of why they're there.
A lot of people have emerged from the scene on different levels, whether it's the producers, the dancers, the DJs. What are your thoughts on this whole anniversary of house music, being from Chicago?
A lot of people invented it, and a lot of people were there in the very beginning, and a lot of people discovered it. It's interesting to hear all the narratives in terms of, what happened when. I'm that guy, because I was buying records, I was collecting records. So I'm like, well, let's look at a copyright date, and then we'll know, when J.M. Silk came out. So you can't say you were there and your record's dated 86 or 87 when Music is a Key might be dated 1985 or Marshall Jefferson. I think that the music should be celebrated, And then everybody has their own narrative. All we know is in the beginning there was Jack. So if you can find Jack, then he can straighten us out. Otherwise, I look at Marshall Jefferson as the beginning of all that. And then I look at Keith Nunnally with J.M. Silk as the vocalist for all that. And so that's where my house history begins, with them. Other people might have different stories.
As far as other Latino artists and contributors, any other people come to mind that should be mentioned? Obviously, there's your Jesse Velez's and, Ralphie Rosario's and Jungle George Suarez. I mean, there's a ton. Any other people you'd like to shout out and kind of give them their P's?
Wow, off the top of my head, Ralphie would have been one. Obviously, Tony would have been another.
Tony Boom Boom.
Right.
Yeah.
What a great question. Mario Reyes was an original. He was at CYC before I was. You know who doesn't get mentioned enough too when I think about it? Liz Torres. Liz Torres, Chicago girl from Lakeview, independent records, ends up on Jive Records. In my estimation, even though she got cover art and stuff like that, she should have been huger than what she was. And when she and Jesse Jones were running the record shops, it's Jesse and Liz, and but they're not thinking that's the queen of house music. That's the woman that had sold so many records. That's the woman that could go to London and sell out, because Chicago isn't great at recognizing your own until other people recognize them. Then when somebody else recognizes them, then you're like, yeah, that's our girl. But you weren't saying that in the beginning. When Quest comes out, you're not showing what your pride is, but now she becomes a major star everywhere else, and let's all support her. Chicago's not great at that. They could be better at that.
Yeah. Lugo Rosado, who was kind of part of that kind of tree, he's definitely early in the game. Him and Carl Baez.
And Lugo will not toot his own horn.
Yeah.
That's not Lugo. Lugo does it, love of the game, like we talked about earlier with Michael Jordan.
I mean, how many Chicago DJs can share stories about performing with Liz at the Paradise Garage?
Right.
There are those people like that. Even Jose Gomez, the name may not be familiar to you. He also goes by Louis Gomez. He is originally from, I think, Blue Island. I met him back in the 80s. He was the guy that introduced Jamie Principle to Frankie Knuckles. Your Love was recorded as a demo, and then Frankie kind of reworked it after he had been playing it off cassette at his parties. What if this person didn't introduce? So those are just prime examples of folks that have started out in Chicago, but they just don't get that same shine here locally.
And I used to tell some of my kids this: you would have to leave here, make it somewhere else, in order to come back here to be accepted. And then everybody says, oh yeah, they're from Chicago.
We didn't do a really good job of documenting our scene. New York maybe a little more, and then after it hit, Europe came here and documented some of that for us.
They have better house music documentaries that come out of Europe, that come out of England, than have come out of Chicago. We might have seen something on Channel 25 back in the day, but I've seen some productions are from overseas, and they do a better job than what's happened from here.
It's unfortunate that people have to pass away for that focus to come to them. It seems that way with a lot of artists, from Jay Dilla to Paul Johnson. Once they were no longer with us, it seemed like fans came out of the woodwork,
You become legend when you're no longer here. And it would be nice to be legend while you are here.
What would your advice be to younger folks entering, whether it be radio or just being an artist, in this age of technology and everything that exists?
I think they need to not expect instant gratification. I think they need to understand that hard work is going to get you where you need to go. And in some cases, that instant gratification might sound as if it's going to work, but that's not long lasting. So it's the hard work that's going to pay off. It's the loyalty to other people that'll pay off, because then they in turn become loyal to you. So then that becomes your support system. It's not about you. It's about everybody that you can impact. And when you do that, that's truly what, measures what you've done. You're a DJ, and I came up in that DJ culture. When you've got somebody like Kenny that made you want to be a DJ. Kenny didn't knock on my door and say, "Hey, do you want to be a DJ?" But he was on the radio. He's doing live stuff, and I finally get to meet him. And I looked at him as, man, this is Kenny Jammin' Jason. But he didn't set out to do that, and he wasn't breaking his arm, patting himself on the back either. He did what he needed to do, and that's what I think some of the younger people could focus on. Have your impact on as many as you can, and it'll come back to you. The self-promotion, the self-titling that some of them do, if you're titling yourself, no, because it's got to be for other people to do that for you. And eventually, people will know what the bottom line is. People will know what the truth is. So you can say you were there, and you can say you did this, that, and the other, but you didn't do it alone. You were surrounded by somebody. It's just not the way it works, at least in my opinion. And when I work with young people, to me, my paying it forward is trying to encourage them to also pay forward whatever it is that they're learning, so it doesn't stop, at them, or it doesn't stop at me. One of the most impactful conversations I had one day was with Bear. He goes by the name of Bear Who now. He was MC Bear at one point.
Edwin Rios.
And we were talking, and he says, if it wasn't for you, like, he told me stories of watching me host events and telling me I want to be like that guy. And I says, Bear, you know how much better you are than I am at that stuff? And he goes, yeah, but man, I would watch you on stage, and man, I wanted to do that. And of course, Bear became Bear. I didn't know that if he had not told me, but he literally said he would watch me on stage, and he says that's what I want to do. And my thing about hosting was always about focusing on who I was introducing. It's not the me show. And you do see some event hosts, and it's all about them. Like, no, you're about to introduce somebody that got hit records. You're about to introduce a dance group. Your gig is to keep the crowd involved and excited. And if there's acts involved, your gig is to pump them up as much as you can so the crowd gets involved and excited. So it's not about the MC, or shouldn't be about the MC. I was excited to be the one to introduce some of these stars. I just thought that was the coolest thing. I'm on the same stage with them.
Anybody you want to thank as we wrap things up?
First and foremost is always my son. On my weekends, when he was like 3 or 4 years old, I'm taking him to the radio station with me because it was my weekend. So I would put him on the air, and he didn't enjoy it first, and eventually he had a blast doing it. Harold brought me in to CYC when I was the outsider, and he didn't have to, but he did. Kenny is important. He thought enough of me to name me program director when he left. He knew that he could trust me to continue the work that he had started in terms of developing, these young broadcasters. Nelson's in heaven now. Nelson is important to my story in terms of freestyle, because once I met him and became friends with him, he went back to New York, and he tells these acts, if you go to Chicago, Harv Roman's the guy that you got to talk to. Harv is the guy that you got to do radio interviews with. And so I would have these acts come in because Nelson said they better. And I'm meeting people because Nelson says I'm the guy in Chicago. Did he have to do that? No. He just did. He's in heaven now, so maybe he doesn't get spoken about enough, but he was vital. If you look at his album credits, if you look at his mix credits, his production credits, he did a lot of stuff. If I'm naming one person in terms of the freestyle, because he made sure that they knew who I was. He made sure that if they came to Chicago, they're looking me up, and he didn't have to do that. Milana, when she was at, or Carrie Cortines, depending on how you know her, when she was at CRX, because CRX and CYC were supposedly rivals, we would share these interviews. So I would tell her, I've got somebody coming to me, and she also did Saturdays, if you remember, and so they'd go from me to her. And I would go on the mic and say, okay, now they're going to 88.1, so if you leave me, don't worry about it. Or she would promote that they were coming to me. We were friends because we both had CYC roots. And when she ended up on CRX, to me, why wouldn't we stay friends, and why wouldn't we do that? You don't see that now. You don't see radio stations sharing interview opportunities because everybody wants it for themselves. I always looked at it like it's about the artist, not necessarily the station. And because Milana was, WCYC family as well, why can't we? That doesn't happen enough anymore. But like, hey, she doesn't get talked about enough for what she ended up doing at CRX. And when people talk about CRX, they'll forget that she started at CYC. For the ones who have an influence, realize that at one point it was your day one and you needed help. You needed a foot in the door and you needed assistance. And now you don't want to help that guy. You don't want to bring on somebody else to learn the craft. Everybody had to start from somewhere. And when you make it, then maybe part of your job is to help other people make it too. Mike Eill's great at that. He says, I give opportunity because I was given opportunity. He's the big comedy promoter here in Chicago. And it makes absolute sense. Somebody gave him a break. He believes in giving other people breaks. And in my line of work, back with the Boys and Girls Clubs and with the radio station, I was lucky enough to be an initial influence. And my hope is that I had influenced them enough to pay it forward. You have moms that brought their kids up on this music. I've had mom tell me that she had headphones on the belly when she was pregnant. She tells me this. I won't name names, but she said that she wanted her baby to love the music. So she did it while she was pregnant. And sure enough, you can find a 22-year-old that loves freestyle, who's younger than all of the music, but because mom hooked her up with the headphones or driving in the car, and these kids found out about it and fell in love with it. So there is a younger generation that has an appreciation for it. So there's hope.
Well, Harv, I'm glad we finally had this conversation. I want to thank you for all the things you've contributed to in the 80s, the parties I was going to and the parties I was DJing at eventually. You were the voice of those parties. So thank you.
Yeah, that redhead kid with the ponytail and the big old headphones. I'm only remembering that because I reposted that Highlanders plugger, and then you do the math about how long ago it was. And I took pictures at that event, and I do have a picture of you, and that was the style.
Oh yeah,
the redhead with the with the tail in the back.
I had no idea I'd end up in radio, and that's been a blessing with Vocalo Radio. So when people ask me if I went to school for radio, I tell them, no, I didn't go to school for radio, but I went to the University of Armando Rivera, Irene Mojica, Harv Roman, the mix show host.
You posted that years ago, and I screen grabbed it. Because when you wrote that, that hit me. I'm like, the school of Harv Roman. Because again, you don't know unless you know. So you're doing this work and you're kind of hoping to have an impact. And then somebody who didn't go to broadcasting school says, I didn't go to school, but Armando, Irene, Harv, that's pretty strong. And then of course you group me in with Armando Rivera, and Irene Mojica, who used to be a CYC herself. It's and they both ended up at GCI. They were major broadcasters. So for me to be grouped into that by you, I told you then and I told you now, that's strong. That did come off as, it's pretty cool.
Awesome, Harv. We got to do this again. We got to get a part 2 going because we only cover so much.
We need 6 more hours.
All right, guys.